We're going to continue thinking about the book of Job here in just a minute once I get this. Telling Lance, I'm surprised everybody have this many people tonight. Sickness is going around pretty solid in a lot of places. So anyway, hopefully everybody can stay well. I've got a couple of kids who are sick, and I'm just telling myself, I'm okay. And just kind of hope that keeps it away. We'll see how that works. But anyway, so last week we began introducing and thinking about Job, and spent a good deal of time just trying to wrap our heads and around the idea of the universal nature of suffering, and gave some examples of people and some of the things, and just how broad it is, and how we need to be cautious of being in a comparison game. When we're suffering, that's a pretty dominant thought at the time, and we need to learn how to handle that and not dismiss people's sufferings because it may be different than ours. Because we all have to learn, and that's one of the ways that we learn to suffer well, is to go by experiences with other ones, and then, as life goes on, it gets a little more complex, it gets harder. And so hopefully what we've learned in the previous stages help us as we continue to progress. And so we got a little bit into the book itself. Just some introductory thoughts about the book itself. The author, it's not really known for certain who wrote the book. There are a couple different ideas, none of which can be proven with any certainty. We left off talking about the date and the setting of the book. We really talked about the date of the book more than anything toward the end. We were talking about how most likely, chronologically, if you want to place Job, it's probably between the descendants of Noah and Abraham. Because one of the main reasons being the age. At the end of the book, he lives 160 years, or 140. Hold on. He lives close to 200 years. If you give... He lives another 140 years, and so at the beginning of the book, he has grown children who are old enough, it seems, to have their own homes and do their own things, and so it would be a safe or fair assessment to say he's probably at least 50 or 60 when this happens to him. He lives another 140 years, that's roughly 200 years, and that time span seems to fit more with Genesis 11 ages, and so... The other thing, the setting of the book, which, as we said last week when we talked about wisdom literature and poetry, it's different because you don't have to know all of the historical backdrop to understand the book. It's just kind of there. Now, can there be some benefits? Sure. But you don't have to know it, okay? As opposed to, say, like when we study kings, you got to kind of know some geography, where the nations are, who the kings are, how do they operate, how do they do some things. With this, you don't have to really know much of anything. You just have to read the story. It's kind of there. And so Job is, according to chapter 1 and verse 1, from the land of Uz. Now, Uz is still a somewhat unknown location. Most people believe it's associated with the nation of Edom, okay, the descendants of Esau. Lamentations 4 and verse 21 makes a reference there. But one of the key things we bring that up just to say this. This book is not about Jewish men, okay? They don't have Jewish names. So that makes it kind of peculiar in the way it operates. As a matter of fact, it seems like most of them are Edomites, descendants of Esau. If, you've got people from Teman, which is also in Edom, and other places. What is interesting, though, is that all of the friends except Elihu, I don't think we're ever told exactly where he's from. But I could be wrong and misremembering. Either way, the three main older friends where they have the most interaction with Job, they are from wisdom centers. Okay? They're from cities that were known and prized wisdom. And so what you have in some of the discussions with Job and with the friends is you have different philosophies of wisdom kind of facing off against each other as they debate why this has happened to Job. And so it's peculiar in the sense that it's dealing with what they would have even considered to be Gentile people. They're not Jewish people. And so it kind of stands out. All right, when we think about the genre of the book, the type of book it is, the literature, we're dealing with a majority of poetry. I mean, the first 2 chapters are going to be what we would call prose. It's just kind of like storytelling. The end of chapter 42, the last half of 42 is kind of like storytelling. But everything else is poetry. And you can see that depending upon your translation, you can usually see it by the way it's marked off in your Bible. The writers are telling you you're dealing with poetry. And so this book is poetic, which influences then how we interpret it. Okay? If a man said, I think I used this one the other day, if a man says to his wife, you're a beautiful flower. Now, I don't know why you would say that, but let's say you said it, okay? It's just an example. It doesn't have to be normal. None of us are thinking, he's married to a flower. Okay? So when we start distinguishing these different types of writings, we all understand it. We may not understand how what you technically call it and how here are 10 basic bullet points on how to interpret it, but we do understand it because it's language. We speak language. We use language. And so when we're dealing with Job, when we get into, and a great portion of it has to do with these speeches and these debates that go on back and forth. This is 42 chapters, and I know what some people are probably thinking, 42 chapters, good grief, we went through Kings and that took forever. What's this going to be? But it's different. It's different in its form. It's different in the way you interpret it. You got big blocks of communication where there's a lot of parallelism is what it's technically called. All it means is you're saying the same thing in multiple ways. So we may have a block of 4 verses, but those 4 verses mean one thing. That's it. And so you can kind of move through them with some speed. And so it's important for us to understand that when we get to it. So when we think about, and keep that in mind, that will, I think, help us as it develops thoughts. Now, I want us to spend some time here thinking about the purpose behind the book, because there are multiple approaches that people take when studying and interpreting the book. And to be honest with you, this is the way I approach it when people say, what is the purpose of the book? Now, with some books in the New Testament, look, it's pretty obvious. I mean, Paul is writing a letter for a reason. He's got something specific in mind, and he is going right at it. Other books, it's not always that easy to know exactly what the author himself is trying to communicate. However, I do believe it is beneficial, and one of the things I see, I think there are like 4 of them I have listed here to talk about. It is interesting to take each one of these views and see how they're viewing it, and I tend to be a person who says, you don't have to just pick one, okay? Why can't I take what is valuable from this way of reading it and this way of reading it and this way of reading it and create my own reading of it, okay? Why do I have to take the good and the bad by choosing? No, you can only read it this way. Said who? I don't know if some police is going to come arrest me because I don't read it, strictly within the lines of something. So, how do we read it? Some people view it as God's character is on trial. And listen, no argument. That's true. Okay, listen to what in chapter 1 and verse 6. It says, now there was a day when the sons of God, a reference to angels, came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, from where have you come? And Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro on the earth. and walking up and down on it. And the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? There is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. Then Satan answered the Lord and said, does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face. And the Lord said to Satan, behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. Okay? So this view comes from this interaction, which is also repeated again, and some of the details change in chapter 2. And so this battle is something that is much bigger than just, why do we suffer? It is putting God on trial. Now, let me explain that. So when Satan appears before God to give an account, God says, where have you been? He says, I've been walking up and down on the earth. And the implication seems to be that what he's saying is, I've been down in my world. You know, everybody's kind of doing what I want them to do down here, which would be consistent. The New Testament describes him as the God of this world. His influence is certainly dominant in the world. And God says, well, and I'm just kind of offering you a rough summarization / translation. God says, well, you don't have Job. You may have a lot of people, but you don't have Job. And Satan says, well, here's the thing about him. Yeah, I don't have him, but there's some fine print we need to talk about. And that is, you baby him. You baby him. You bribe him. You put a hedge around him. That is, you put a hedge of protection around him to where nothing bad happens to him. And you've made him a multi-billionaire. Well, of course he serves you. Why wouldn't he? If you made him rich and you protected him from bad things happening to him, why wouldn't he serve you? So the accusation that Job is hurling against God is that you by yourself are not enough for people to love and to worship. That's the accusation. In essence, if you want people to follow you, they've got to be on your payroll. You've got to bribe them. That's the only reason they follow you. So you see that the whole discussion then becomes about the character of God. Is he simply buying adoration? Or do people actually serve God because of who he is and not what they can get from him? And this deals with a principle that we'll talk about here in just a little bit, one of the keys to interpreting it, and that is the retribution principle. But we'll talk more about that in just a minute. So the question is, this way of reading it is, God is on trial, and Job is basically caught in the middle. He's the one that God sets forward that says, no, I can prove to you that people don't just worship me because I pay them, and Job is a prime example. Take everything he has. Well, chapter 2, it intensifies. Well, of course, we took everything he had, but we didn't touch him. It's kind of easy to serve God if you're not personally hurting. Skin for skin, all that a man has will give for his skin. That is, if push comes to shove, we would sacrifice anybody in the world and everything that we had to save ourselves. That's the principle that Satan is arguing from. And God says, okay, you can touch his skin, but you can't kill him. And so both of them still deal with the same thing. All right? The second approach is it's viewed as an invitation to trust God's wisdom. If you watch the introduction, The Bible Project, which I would encourage you, The Bible Project on YouTube, if you're going to even just read or study any book, you need to watch the introduction that they give. I mean, it's not a wholesale endorsement of every single little thing they say, but their stuff is, it's hard to beat. And he's drawing it. As he explains to you the whole story, he's drawing it, and so you're watching him. It's really phenomenal what they've done. But anyway, this is the approach that he takes. And so, in essence, the way Job is to be read is this. It's about human suffering, and we're trying to figure God out, so to speak. That is, When you look at Job's friends and you look at Job, they're trying to figure out God. They're trying to solve the puzzle, the Rubik's Cube of God. Now, there are two approaches. The friends, when they approach God, they oversimplify God. Okay? Oversimplify. The friends' basic thinking is this. If you were to put it in a logical syllogism, which is nothing but fancy terminology for this is how you make a philosophical argument. Okay? Major premise is this. All suffering is a result of sin. The minor premise is Job is suffering. The conclusion is, therefore, Job must be a sinner. Now, logically, if we're just talking logically, that syllogism, that argument is correct. Okay? But that gets into a whole thing that 2 weeks of 6 hours a day that I'd rather forget I ever had in my life. But anyway, the argument is philosophically, logically sound. Biblically, it's as flawed can be. And that's the thing about logic. You can make a logical argument, but the argument itself be, as dumb as a hammer. It doesn't have to be any good. So, that's what they're saying. They oversimplify God. So if you're suffering, it must be because you're a sinner. All suffering is a result of sin. So you suffer, you're a sinner. Simple conclusion. But then when you get to Job, he comes and when his approach is he hurls accusations at God. And we'll talk about why that is. There's some things going on in his head that he's trying to work out as well. But either way, both of those conclusions are things that we don't really want to buy into, where we oversimplify God or where we make accusations that are not true and accurate about God. And so, in essence, it's seen as Job never knows why this happens to him. All throughout the book, unless Job wrote the book, Job never finds out why all this happens to him. Okay? Never. So, as one writer put it, he summarized the book in 3 statements. We often suffer. We sometimes understand. Sometimes we do know why we're suffering. It could be a boneheaded decision we made, right? But we can always trust. Okay? So that's kind of the approach. We're simply trusting God even though we can't fully understand what is going on, which is an absolutely true statement. So, this is a statement that I've made. This is a statement I've heard many people make. And that is, we think that if somehow we can understand our suffering, it will make the pain bearable. If I can understand why it's happening, it will be easier to bear. This way of reading the book says that thinking is flawed. Okay? So you're dealing with criminals. One of my friends is an FBI agent, and he was involved in getting a confession from a very famous case. And when you deal with why is someone's life taken, why is someone murdered, one of the main things people want to know is why. But here's the thing. Many times you're dealing with someone who's a sociopath. You're not going to find out why. There isn't a reason. And even if you had a full explanation of everything, it doesn't change the net result. Okay? Or there are things that we go through, we think, if I understand it, it'll make it easier. Probably not. Probably not. But here's the thing, too. We have to also understand that, and we'll get into this, all relates to something about sovereignty, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. And so the basic premise is simply trust him. Because when you read the book, Job never finds out what happens to him, but he simply trusts God. And the message of the book is basically this: I don't have to know why things happen. I believe that whatever happens, I'm in the hands of a wise and gracious God who does understand, and that's what matters. I tend to think that's probably right. So another view, and this is not a very prominent one, is that Job is focusing on the wrong thing, that Job is self-centered and God is trying to help him realize not everything is about him. I mean, Job does get a little self-centered sometimes, but that's not what this book is about, so that's a little crazy. The last one we'll think about is God defeating evil. And this has to do with especially a focus on when God speaks to Job, and he talks about especially Behemoth and Leviathan. And so how do you interpret Behemoth and Leviathan? Well, that's going to be fun. But anyway, there is a view that is very good, in my opinion, and that is, I personally do not believe Behemoth and Leviathan is talking about actual animals. Okay? Now, that doesn't make me an anti-dinosaur person, okay? I just don't think that's what he's talking about. And when you look at Jewish literature and how they spoke of Behemoth and Leviathan, one is a land creature and one is a sea creature. They're not so much, they may have been literal creatures, but really it's more about what they're associated with, and that is that they're chaotic. You can't control them. And when you read what God says to Job, that's his point. You can't control them. Okay? And so they represent in Jewish thinking, now I understand they're not Jewish in the book, but it is a book in a Jewish canon, so we're still addressing Jewish thinking. And that is that they represent evil. And that view can be strengthened when you look at, say, Revelation 13, when you've got two beasts, one rising from the sea and one rising on the earth. Okay? But that'll be its own fun discussion at that point. So basically what God is communicating with Behemoth and Leviathan is simply this. You're right, there are things in this world, Job, that are out of control. But ultimately, one day I'm going to put things back in their correct order. Okay? Now, whether that's what the whole book is about, I don't know. It's certainly a true principle, I know. That God does say things are not the way I intended them to be, and I fully intend to put everything back to the way it's supposed to be. But these readings will kind of help us, if we'll pay close attention to them, that we're kind of looking at it through multiple lenses, okay? And I understand that what I'm doing right now, it seems abstract, it seems like it doesn't make any sense, it seems like it's theoretical, and how does it influence anything? But it influences everything. When you and I interact with something, we're interacting with assumptions we don't even know we have. The reason why we go through introductions like this is to force us to name the assumptions, okay? Let me show you. That will be clear here when we think about keys of interpretation, okay? Sovereignty. God's control over the earth and the world. We're going to look at about, and just when I say look, I mean we're going to very generally speak of about 7, 8, 9 different views of sovereignty. People say, I don't know anything about God's sovereignty. Yeah, you do. You just don't know you do. It's in the way you talk. Now, you may not call it sovereignty, but it's exactly, you have a view of it. You just don't know. For an example, everything happens for a reason. Where's that come from? When some people, when they teach on suffering, one of the ways they comfort people as they're suffering is that God ordained this from all eternity for you to endure this so that God could make you better. Where's that come from? God only gives his hardest battles to his strongest soldiers. Where's that come from? God had a purpose in their death. It's from views of sovereignty that couldn't be more wrong if they tried. I'm going to tell you something. I've lost plenty of people that I loved, and the notion that says, well, it was God's plan for him to die, there's the back door. You need to walk out of it. Can you read the Bible? God is concerned about giving one thing: life. He hates death. His Son came into the world that he might deliver those who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to slavery. God hates death. God is a God of life. Death is something that's like a monster that's invaded his creation because of our sinfulness. And it's something that his Son in his resurrection is seeking to destroy. So let's think about it. So there's the view of classical theism, which is that God has complete control over all events. Everything that happens is a part of God's plan. Everything that happens, it somehow works in God's plan. There is a much stronger view in Calvinism and Reformed theology that says that God's sovereignty is absolute. That is, he predestines every single event, including salvation, including the death of people. I mean, to illustrate it, they will say something like, God even ordained every blade of grass and the wind and what time it would hit it and how it would flow against it. Well, maybe he did. Or maybe he just set laws in place in the world and that's just like how it works. He has knowledge of it, but knowledge of something doesn't mean you make things happen or that you even ordain that they have to happen. But this is where you get the notion of if it's your time to go, it's your time to go. God has got a day that you're going to die. Now look, he may know the day that someone's going to die. But you know, there is just a simple problem with this. If it's my time to go, it's my time to go, and so I just simply choose to step out in front of the oncoming traffic and die. Did God make me do that? It's this notion that everything, even, look, you go back and you read the old catechisms and the old confessions of faith where salvation is like this. Before the world began, God decreed before the world began that certain individuals should be saved and certain individuals should be lost. And the amount of individuals is so certain that it can neither be added thereto nor taken therefrom. That's a quote from their confession of faith. If you're lost, and there's nothing you can do about it. God ordained you to die. Sending you to hell manifests his glory. Okay? Then you have what is called an Arminian view, which is God is sovereign. He's in control of all things, but he gives people free will. We have choices. There are things. Similar to that is something called open theism, which is God is sovereign, and He allows for human freedom, and He allows people to kind of choose what they want to do, and as they choose what they want to do, He responds according to what they choose. Very similar to that is something called process theology, which is God influences the world and He's in control of it, but in the process of time, we have the ability to choose what we want. That is, God can sometimes, especially with open theism, what I didn't say, is that God can choose not to know certain things. And people say, well, that's logically inconsistent. Well, here's the thing. Try and put God in a syllogism, I dare you. I know people who do it, and it's not going to do you any good. Then you've got deism, which is kind of the idea that God wound the world up, kind of like those, the old grandfather clocks that you would take the key and you'd twist it and twist it and twist it and wind it, and then you'd pull it out, put it up, and you step back from it and just let it go. That's kind of the idea. And by the way, many of the founding fathers of our nation were deists. They believed the world was just, not all of them, but many of them had this view that the world had simply just been set in place and God stepped back from it. It was up to man and man's will. It came from Enlightenment thinking and all kind of different things. But anyway, there's deism. And then there's pantheism, which is more of like Eastern religions. God is synonymous with the universe. God is in everything, and God kind of is everything, and so suffering kind of fits in there in some strange way. Okay? So which one of these is right? I'll be honest, I don't know. We're dealing with God here. There are some of them I can tell you for certain. That's not right. Okay? Hardcore Calvinistic Reformed dogmatics that say that human beings don't have any ability to choose and that God ordains and forces everything that we do, that's just inconsistent with what you read in the Bible. Okay? And I know people who would disagree strongly with that. Deism, obviously, I don't think that's correct at all. Pantheism is certainly not correct at all. But God is certainly in control of things, but He's also given us free will. Now, how all that works, I don't know. And I've never really read anybody that could make an explanation where, it's one thing to put forth ideas. It's another thing to actually prove it. And I've never seen anybody that can prove it. So somewhere in the midst of these things is how God superintends the world in a way that He remains in control, but at the same time, we have choices. Okay, very briefly here, let's talk about approaches to suffering very quickly in kind of the same rapid-fire pace. Stoicism. Stoicism, Paul interacts with Stoics in Acts. Stoicism is basically, and it's become pretty popular again in American circles. As a matter of fact, Lane Kiffin, the head coach at Ole Miss, he's a very big fan of Ryan Holiday, who's a Stoic philosopher and approach, that basically says suffering arises from events, not from events, but our judgments about them. That is, it's not really suffering unless you admit it, and basically suffering comes to develop resilience. And so you should look at your challenges as an opportunity to grow. Now, is there some of that that's right? Yeah. I think there's some of that that's right. Is suffering not an opportunity to grow? I think so. I think that's one of the things that Job talks about. When he says in chapter 42, I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. What is the difference between hearing someone's voice and actually seeing them? It's a bigger picture. It's a fuller picture. What is Job saying? I thought I knew you before, but that was just like listening to your voice. Now I can see you. It's different. I've grown in the process. There is the approach of Buddhism, and listen, these are sometimes they're technical names. They find their way into cultures all the time. Right now, our nation is very infatuated with Eastern cultures and Eastern religions. New Age thinking, they're very fascinated by it. Buddhism says suffering is inherent in life, but it's due to your attachment and craving. And so the goal of Buddhism is to eliminate suffering by basically killing your attachments to the world and feeling. That's the state of nirvana. Translation is like this. If I have no attachments to this world, I have no feelings, therefore I cannot suffer. That's why they go and live in monasteries where they're not around their families. They're detaching themselves from the world so that if something happens to their family, well, they don't really have an attachment to them anyway, because they're only really suffering because they have an attachment to something in the world. So the key is to kill attachment. It's to bury your emotion and to pretend it doesn't exist. There's hedonism, which is all about pleasure. So suffering is to be minimized, do things that make you happy, and because you only get one chance at life, and so only do the things that make you happy. Some things about it that are okay, some things about it, obviously, that are really bad. Nietzsche, the famed philosopher, very influential in modern psychology, suffering is necessary for growth and to achieve greatness. And if you can overcome your suffering, you can create your own values. You're the captain of your own salvation. No one will tell you what to do because you've endured it on your own and you've made it. Okay? We'll stop there and come back around to these last 3 or 4 and then talk about one other thing, and then we will move into the book hopefully next week. But again, I know it's not the most scintillating thing in the world, and I appreciate your patience, but I do think if we become familiar with it as we talk about it through the book, we can look at things and say, this is this approach, this is this approach, this is this approach. And when we walk out into the world and we hear people say things to us about things that happen in this world, you can start to identify what's going on and what is behind that thinking. And then begin to ask yourself, does that line up with what the Bible says? It's about living in a Christian way and learning to think through life. Okay, so we'll stop there and then hopefully move forward next week.